Scripture for the message is Luke 6, verse 37 to 42. Jesus says, "Judge not, and you will not be judged. Condemn not, and you will not be condemned. Forgive, and you will be forgiven. Give, and it will be given to you. Good measure, pressed down, shaken together, running over, will be put into your lap. For with the measure you use, it will be measured back to you." He also told them a parable. "Can a blind man lead a blind man? Will they not both fall into a pit? A disciple is not above his teacher, but everyone, when he's fully trained, will be like his teacher. Why do you see the speck that is in your brother's eye, but not notice the log that is in your own eye? How can you say to your brother, 'Brother, let me take that speck out that is in your eye,' when you do not see the log which is in your own eye? Hypocrite, first take the log out of your own eye, and then you will see clearly to take out the speck that is in your brother's eye." May God add his blessing to the reading of his word. We don't know why people do the things they do. That's an important truth to remember as we hear two different teachings of Jesus. One of them is in the Beatitudes. "Blessed are those who give mercy, for they will receive mercy." And the second one was in our text this morning. The measure we use to measure others by will be the measurement we are measured by. That second thought and teaching is kind of scary, because we tend to be so quick to judge others, because we think we know why they did something they've done, and we're ready to point it out to them why they shouldn't be doing that. But the truth is, only Jesus knows why people do the things they do, and so only he can judge. That's what our text lifts up for us today, as Jesus starts out simply with, "Do not judge, and you will not be judged." And then he mentions condemning as well in the same way. If instead of judging or condemning, what we're called to do, he says, is to give. And if we do that, it will be given to you. Giving in that day, when they're measuring out grain, often they'd have an extra cloak and almost like an apron, and they would lift it up and it would get filled in. And here he says, good measure, pressed down, shaken, pouring over, as if it's not a slim measurement or a cheating one. It's a overwhelming measurement, as if he's saying God gives in this gracious, overflowing way. And so we're called to give in the same way to our fellow man. For the measure by which you measure, it will be measured to you correspondingly. So there's that statement of his. If we measure people in a stingy, harsh way, then that's the way we will be measured. If we're blind, Jesus says, to know how God treats others, how can we help them? We'll only lead them to a fall. It would be the blind leading the blind. In order to help others, our eye has to be clear, the eye of our heart. So he tells that famous parable about the speck and the log, or you could say it's the chip and the beam. Remember Joseph, the father was a carpenter, and so he probably gets these images from the carpentry shop. They didn't have electric saws back then, so you don't have as much sawdust, but you do have chips of wood that could be fairly small that would break off a piece of wood. And then beam would be a larger section of wood. Of course, I picture today like a 2x4 or something, and Jesus is exaggerating to make a point. You can't get a 2x4 literally in your eye, but you can imagine a 2x4 blocking your vision compared to just having a little chip of wood somehow getting in somebody's eye. And he's basically saying with that parable, in order not to be a hypocrite, we would have to take the beam out of our own eye first, before we'd have the ability to even be able to take a small chip out of somebody else's eye. To me, that all points out we do not know why people do the things they do, because our own shortcomings cloud our vision, our spiritual vision in this case. We're called to trust in Jesus. Only He can truly see and be able to help others. This truth came home to me in an especially strong way one time when I was back in seminary. So this was in the 80s in New Jersey. And there was a woman at the church named Edith. There was 3 older couples that used to sit all together in the back corner over there of the church. A younger woman named Sue, and her daughter was somewhere between 4 and 6 years old, would sit in the middle aisle and right about the middle of the pews there. Well, one Sunday, Sue came in right as church had already started. And in that particular church, the door, instead of being over here, was way over here to the side. There was a little sharp north exit, and then you came right into the sanctuary. So she came in there, and because the service already started, she didn't want to walk down the middle aisle and sit in the middle. So she snuck into the back, the second to the last pew in the back, her and her daughter. And we're sitting there as I think we were probably singing the first song at that particular time. Well, nothing odd about that, except it was a few minutes after that Edith and her husband arrived. And they saw Sue and the daughter sitting in their pew, quote unquote. So they just froze there for a second. But then their friends in the back pew slid over, so they went in and sat down there and back. And of course, I noticed all of this from the pulpit, but didn't think much of it. We can sit in different places at different times. Doesn't actually kill us. So I didn't think anything big about it. But the next day, out of those 3 couples, the other 2 ladies, the 2 friends of Edith, came over to the parsonage to visit me. And they said, "Did you notice that Sue left the church crying yesterday?" And I thought, no, she must have waited until after she shook hands and was past that, and before she started crying. And I wondered why she did. And well, they said, well, you saw where she sat yesterday. And I said, yes. And I saw that and said, well, after Edith had been sitting for a while behind them, she said in a voice loud enough for Sue and the daughter to hear, but of course not loud enough for me to hear way up in the pulpit, I don't know why they even come here. They don't support the church like we do. So they said that one of the friends, Audrey, had run out afterwards when she saw Sue was upset and caught up with her and told her, "You're welcome here any time." And they had just been coming a few times, and said that you're always welcome here, and don't pay any attention to what my friend said. Sometimes Edith says things, quote unquote. So they were leaving this matter in my hands. "Pastor, you take care of this now." So thank you very much, I was thinking, but didn't say that actually out loud. But after they left, I was very angry at Edith. It's hard enough to get young people who hadn't come to church to start coming to church. We don't need to drive them out a few weeks after they start getting here. And so I was ready to march over there to her house and tell her what she did wrong and make sure she never did anything like that again. And I probably would have been a lot more forceful in my gestures back at that particular time. But I was fairly new in ministry and I was fairly immature, but at least I guess one thing that got right was I thought I better pray first. And I don't even remember what I prayed for after they left there in the parsonage. It could have been, "Lord, don't let me say something I'm going to regret," or it might have just been, "Lord, help me to say something that actually works and actually is meaningful." I'm not sure the details of what it was. But after the prayer, I kind of sat back and I still thought I needed to go over there, but now I wasn't sure exactly what specifically I was going to say. Before that prayer, I knew what I was going to say. I was going to tell her, you shouldn't do this. This was wrong, and I don't want to see anything like that ever happen again. And so I knew that's what I was going to say before the prayer. Well, I went over that afternoon. Her husband was just a few blocks away, so I just walked. Her husband opened the door. He kind of looked a little squeamish and sheepish, and so, but he let me in, and I asked if I could talk to Edith. And he went and got her, and then he kind of stayed out of the conversation. Probably didn't want to hear what was being said. So whether that's smart or not, you can decide later. But so we're sitting there together, and it's quiet, and I'm thinking, okay, what do we do? And so I tried to listen first by saying, how have you been doing lately? And she said, well, not very good. And she proceeded to start telling me this long story about a son of hers who lived down in Florida. And he was having to go through a divorce that he didn't want to have. And he was calling his mom up in Jersey on the phone and, crying and very sad. And she was wishing she could go down and be with him. But a few months before, and I knew this, she had had some heart surgery, fairly minor, but still heart surgery. And so she wasn't able to fly at that time and be able to get down there. So she was just upset. I feel so helpless. There's seems like nothing I can do except listen to him on the phone, and we didn't have internet back then, at least that I knew of. And so you couldn't see him on Skype or anything. So it's like, what do I do now? Do I tell her about this incident? Well, we ended up having prayer, and we prayed about this situation with the son, and yet never seemed right to bring up the situation with Sue that occurred at church. So we just left that day without mentioning it. But that's not the end of the story. A few years later, we got a letter from one of those friends that had come over to the parsonage, Audrey. She kept in touch with Tammy back when people actually wrote letters by hand and sent them in the mail. And she would update us about news from what was going on in the congregation. And she mentioned just off to the side that they had found out that Edith had Alzheimer's. And by that time in my life, my mom was already in a fairly late stage of Alzheimer's, as you know we've talked about before. And I was thinking, well, of course, one of the first public acknowledgement that someone might have Alzheimer's is they say things out loud that they would never normally ever say. And as soon as I thought of that, it's like God took me back to that very day when I was so ready to march over to her house and tell her what a sinner she was and how she should never do something like that again. How little we know about why people do the things that they do. How much more reason to leave all judgment up to Jesus. Let us remember we'll be measured with the measurement we use for others. So let us give mercy so that we may receive mercy. Only Jesus knows why people do the things they do. And so only he can judge. So let us take the beam out of our own eye. And only then can we see others as Jesus truly sees them.